Have you ever looked back at an old picture of yourself and thought, hmm, nobody looking at that picture would have known what I was going through? You're smiling. Maybe you're even laughing. Maybe you're surrounded by friends. Maybe you're the loudest person in the room. And nobody knows that underneath that smile, you are hurting. I know what that feels like because I learned very young how to look okay when I wasn't okay. And sometimes I wonder how much of what we learn to hide as children follows us into adulthood. That's what I want to talk about today. Welcome to The Secrets We Keep, the Lies We Tell, a podcast about the stories we survive, the truths we uncover, and the healing that begins when secrets no longer define us. I'm Gina, and I'm so glad you're here. Before we begin, let me take care of a little housekeeping. This podcast is for educational, informational, inspirational, reflection, and awareness purposes only. I am not a licensed therapist, counselor, or attorney. Although I am a registered nurse, I'm not acting in that professional role during this podcast. Nothing shared here should be considered medical advice, mental health advice, therapy, diagnosis, legal advice, professional counseling, or emergency support. Some episodes may discuss some sensitive subjects, including domestic violence, abuse, trauma, SA, mental health, suicide, grief, and other difficult life experiences. Please take care of yourself while listening and seek support from qualified professionals and appropriate resources when you need it. If you are in immediate danger or experiencing an emergency, please contact emergency services in your area. Listener discretion is advised. Now, let's talk. Recently, I had a dinner for my grandson's 21st birthday. He had some friends with him, and their birthdays are all real close together. So they're all Leos. So they were celebrating this season of turning 21. And watching them made me think about being young, 21. Do you remember 21? Lord, some of us probably shouldn't remember everything we did at 21. And some things are probably better left right there. But it did make me smile. I started thinking about getting, my first car, first taste of freedom, going out with friends, just doing things we now know weren't necessarily the smartest things in the world. And then I started thinking even further back. I thought about, being a kid. So, we didn't have bike paths half the time. We were just out there riding our bikes. And, we didn't have helmets. Somebody was riding a bike, somebody was sitting on the handlebars, and somehow we thought that was perfectly reasonable. We drank water straight out the water hose. Remember our parents? I know my parents used to say, "Stop running in and out the house. You running my light bill up." So we stayed outside. We made up games. We played dodgeball and kickball and red light, green light. And we knew when to come in because when the street lights came on, that was our signal. It was time to go in the house. That was freedom. And as I thought about it, I realized something that made me a little sad. I didn't have enough of those moments. I had some. I had laughter. I had friends. I had moments of being a child. But so much of my childhood was also spent learning how to read a room, learning when to be quiet, learning what not to say, learning what happened at home stayed at home. and learning how to make sure nobody knew what was really going on. I talk about some of that in my book, The Secrets I Keep, The Lies I Tell, available on Amazon. But when I look back now, I realize I became a very good person at having two faces. Not being fake two faces, but surviving. And there's a difference. I could become invisible when I needed to, quiet, watchful, observant. But then I could walk into another environment and become loud and funny and boisterous. I could be the life of the party. I could laugh and joke and dance. I could have everybody around me laughing. And they had no idea what was happening underneath all of that. I learned how to wear a facade before I even knew what the word facade meant. And here's what I've been thinking about. What happens when a child gets really good at that? What happens when that child grows up? Because I grew up, but some of those survival skills, they grew up right with me. I think about friendships now. I have a very small circle, and I've always said that, you know, that's just part of my personality. I don't trust people, and I don't trust easily. My mother used to tell me if I had one or two good friends in my entire life, that I was doing well. So, by that measure, I am doing very well. I have a best friend today who was my best friend when we were younger. Our lives were kind of parallel. Both of our fathers struggled with alcohol. Now, I can't tell her story or tell you what happened inside her home because that's her story to tell. I can only tell mine. But sometimes I wonder whether those early experiences affected how I learned, to connect with people. Because I know how to have a best friend, I know how to love someone deeply, I know how to be loyal. But acquaintances, people who are not quite inside the circle, but they're not strangers either. I don't really know what that looks like. You're either in or you're out. And I started wondering whether that came from learning so young that letting people close meant letting them see things I was trying desperately to hide. And then I thought about my marriage. And that's when this reflection became even harder. Because when I look back at my marriage, in many ways, it became a mirror of my childhood. Arguments. I mean, very few genuinely peaceful moments. Jealousy, insecurity, distrust, adultery, violence. It was a mirror of my childhood. Emotionally, I had left one environment and somehow entered another environment where so many of the feelings were familiar. And familiarity is a strange thing. You know, familiar doesn't necessarily mean it's healthy. Familiar doesn't necessarily mean it's safe. Sometimes familiar just simply means I know how to survive or I'm used to this. I know that feeling. I married very young. And as I've shared before, I was not deeply in love when I married. At that point in my life, I was already a young mother. I was working, I was going to school, and yes, I was partying. Could I have made different choices? Absolutely. Could I have been a better mother in some moments? Absolutely. I can look back now and admit that without destroying the young woman I was then, I was a teenager when I became a mother. I was still growing up while trying to raise someone else. My parents believed I needed to settle down. Now, they weren't together, but they agreed on that. I needed to stop partying. I needed to be a mother. I needed to get married. And so eventually I did. But what nobody could have known then was what that marriage would become. Very early in that marriage, I started crying out for help. And one of the hardest things about asking for help is when people listen, but they don't hear you. There's a difference. You can tell someone what's happening, you can tell them again and again and again. But if what you're saying doesn't fit the version of your life that they believe, sometimes they don't hear you until much later. By the time people truly understood what I had been saying, I was exhausted mentally, emotionally, physically. I was confused. I was frustrated. I was lost. And somewhere inside all of that, I still knew how to smile. I could still go somewhere and laugh. I could still joke. I could still party. I could still be loud. I could still look like Gina. And nobody looking from the outside necessarily knew what Gina was carrying on the inside. That's why I want to be very careful about something I'm going to say next. There were moments in my life when I was so overwhelmed that I wanted the pain to stop. My faith mattered tremendously to me during those times. Prayer was important. Knowing people were praying for me was important. And somehow I kept moving forward. But that experience taught me something I still carry today. We cannot always tell what another person is carrying by looking at them. Sometimes there are warning signs when someone is in deep emotional distress. Sometimes those signs are subtle. And sometimes people become incredibly good at hiding their pain. I know because I hid mine. So when someone dies by suicide, I don't believe the people left behind should automatically carry the burden of thinking, I should have known. Because sometimes you could have known. Sometimes the person you loved worked very hard to make sure you did not know. But what we can do is become more intentional about one another. We have to stop saying, how are you? And then responding, I'm fine. And then they say, okay, good. But sometimes we need to say, no, really, how are you? And then being quiet long enough to hear the answer. Because there's listening and there's hearing. I spent years feeling like people were listening to me without actually hearing me. And I wonder how many people listening to this podcast have felt exactly the same way. I don't know. Maybe you learn how to smile while hurting too. Maybe you're the funny one, the strong one, the dependable one, the one everybody calls when their life is falling apart. But nobody thinks to ask whether yours is falling apart. Maybe you've gotten so good at saying, I'm fine, that people stopped asking whether you really are. And maybe you don't even know how to answer anymore. I also think about what children learn from watching us because children feel things we think we're hiding. They feel tension. They hear those arguments. They notice silence. They recognize when affection is missing. They absorb the emotional temperature of a home long before they have the vocabulary to explain it. That's one reason I no longer believe that simply staying together father children automatically protects the children. I know every family situation is different, and those decisions can be incredibly complicated. But I do believe we have to ask ourselves an honest question. What are our children learning from the love we are showing them? Are they learning that love feels safe, that people communicate, that disagreement does not require cruelty, that affection is okay, that apologies matter, to respect boundaries, that asking for help is okay? Or are they learning that love means walking on eggshells, that silence keeps the peace, that jealousy means someone cares, that chaos is normal, that love hurts? Those lessons don't necessarily disappear when children become adults. Sometimes we carry them straight into our own relationships. I know I carried some of mine. And that's why loving ourselves matters. That's why healing matters. That's why learning ourselves matters. Because if we don't examine what we've inherited emotionally, we can unknowingly hand it to the next generation. And I don't say that to shame parents. I was a young mother. I made plenty of mistakes. I would definitely do some things differently if I had the knowledge then that I have now. But I cannot go back and raise my child again. None of us can. What we can do is learn. We can apologize, we can change, we can heal, and we can decide that something stops with us. Maybe that's what I've been thinking about since watching those 21-year-olds celebrate. I wasn't just remembering being young. I was thinking about everything that young people deserve to have before adulthood asks them to carry adult things. They deserve laughter and safety, friendship, freedom, trust. They deserve to have people they can talk to, memories that don't require healing. And maybe some of us didn't get enough of those things. We can't change that, but we can acknowledge it. And we can stop pretending it didn't affect us. Because maybe one of the biggest secrets we keep is the belief that because we survive something, it no longer matters. But it does matter. Not because we have to live there forever, we don't have to live in it, but because understanding where we've been can help us understand who we became. I understand my small circle a little better now. I understand my difficulty trusting people a little better. I understand why I could be hurting and still be the loudest person at the party. I understand why silence became so easy. And I also understand why being truly seen became so important to me. Maybe healing is not becoming someone completely different. Perhaps healing is finally understanding the person you've been all along. So today, I want to leave you with this. Look beyond the smile, sometimes even your own. Ask the second question. Listen for the answer. Love your children in ways they can feel. Let them see healthy love. And if there are things from your childhood that followed you into adulthood, you do not have to be ashamed of them. But you do deserve the opportunity to understand them because the secrets we keep don't disappear simply because we stop talking about them. Sometimes they become the patterns we live. And healing begins when we're finally willing to see them. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for allowing me to share another piece of my story. And if something I said today made you think about your own story, maybe sit with it for a little while. You don't have to solve everything today. Sometimes recognizing the pattern is the beginning. Until next time, protect your peace, speak your truth, continue to heal, and take good care of yourself.